The annual parish tea at St. Mildred's Church had always been the sort of event in which very little happened, and what did happen was discussed for months afterward. The tables were arranged neatly under the great yew tree, whose dark branches cast soft shadows across the churchyard lawn. Polished silver teapots gleamed in the sunlight, sponge cakes were lined up on lace-bordered plates, and vases of pale summer roses gave off a light, fresh scent. It was the kind of English afternoon that felt almost rehearsed, as if made to reassure everyone present that life was as gentle and orderly as it appeared. Miss Jane Marple arrived exactly at 3:30, walking with the careful, unhurried steps of someone who never felt the need to rush. Her pale blue dress blended gently with the summer sky, and her gloved hands clasped a small handbag in front of her. She nodded to the vicar's wife, Mrs. Chiverton, who fluttered toward her with the warm enthusiasm of a hostess determined to maintain pleasant appearances. "Miss Marple, my dear, so glad you could come. We've had a rather splendid turnout, haven't we?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, smiling mildly. "It seems everyone has found the weather agreeable today. Everyone. And something else. For there was a new presence in the village, and nothing intrigued St. Mary Mead quite as thoroughly as a newcomer." Mr. Leonard Graves stood near the refreshment table, pouring himself a cup of tea. He was an elegant man, perhaps in his late 60s, with silver hair brushed immaculately back, and a suit that suggested money, or at least the careful illusion of it. He had arrived in the village just 6 weeks earlier, taking up residence in the old Barton cottage at the edge of the common. Some found him charming. Others found him too charming. Miss Marple watched from her seat beneath the yew tree as Mrs. Sylvia Hawthorne, a widow of comfortable means, leaned forward eagerly to speak to him. Her hand lingered a moment too long on his sleeve. Her laugh was a touch too warm. Miss Marple did not stare, but her eyes softened, as though she had seen this very scene once before, many years earlier, in another county entirely, involving very similar personalities. At the next table, 2 women whispered as they sliced plum cakes. "They say he used to be in finance," murmured Mrs. Price. "Used to be," echoed Mrs. Alderton meaningfully. "That's what they say, but no one knows where his money comes from." "From Sylvia Hawthorne, soon enough," Mrs. Price muttered. Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting her gaze drift, apparently without interest. It was at that very moment that the vicar clapped his hands and declared that Mrs. Chiverton's famous lemon-curd tart was ready to be served. A small ripple of polite enthusiasm moved through the gathering, though not enough, Miss Marple observed, to hide the undercurrents of rivalry, jealousy, and village gossip. The tart was sliced. Plates were passed. Conversation resumed. The summer afternoon hummed with bees and chatter. And then it happened. A sharp, sudden choking sound. A gasp. A cup clattered against a saucer. All heads turned at once. Mr. Leonard Graves had risen abruptly to his feet, his face contorted, one hand gripping the edge of the table as though the world itself had tilted beneath him. His other hand clutched his chest. "Mr. Graves?" Mrs. Hawthorne cried, rising beside him, but it was too late. His knees buckled. He collapsed onto the grass, his teacup rolling away across the lawn. A stunned silence fell, broken only by the distant ringing of the church bell. Mrs. Chiverton screamed. The vicar rushed forward. Miss Marple did not move to intervene. Not yet. She sat entirely still and watched. And she noticed how Mrs. Hawthorne's expression flickered. Grief, fear, and something sharper. harder to name. She noticed the untouched tart slice on Mr. Graves's plate, except for one single bite. She noticed the faint scent of almonds rising through the summer air, almost lost beneath the rose blossoms. "Fetch the doctor," the vicar cried, but Miss Marple already knew. Mr. Leonard Graves was quite dead, and he had been murdered. The shock of the moment seemed to suspend time. Even the birds, which had been chirping in the high branches of the yew tree, quieted as though nature itself were observing decorum. Mrs. Hawthorne knelt beside Mr. Graves, her gloved hand hovering inches above his sleeve, as if to touch him now would make the reality undeniable. Her face had drained of color, leaving only the bright, frantic gleam of her eyes. Dr. Penworthy was fetched from his nearby surgery and arrived within minutes, flushed, perspiring slightly, and already annoyed before he reached the lawn. He knelt beside the body, his bag clattering open with professional haste. A stethoscope was applied, a brow furrowed, a brief grim sigh followed. "There is nothing to be done," he announced quietly, though his voice carried clearly to the entire gathering. "The man is dead." Gasps and murmurs swelled like a low tide. Someone began to cry softly. Someone else muttered a prayer. Miss Marple, still seated, simply lowered her gaze as though acknowledging a truth she had foreseen. Her hands remained folded, composed, but her mind, quick as a sparrow's dart, had already begun its work. It was Mrs. Chiverton who broke first, her voice trembling. But how? How could such a thing happen at a parish tea? She looked around wildly, as if the event might accuse her. Dr. Penworthy cleared his throat. A heart attack is the most likely explanation. Sudden, quite sudden. But even he did not sound convinced. Miss Marple raised her eyes, not to contradict, but to observe. Everyone in the churchyard was reacting at once. And reactions, Miss Marple knew, were often more revealing than statements. Mrs. Hawthorne was weeping in a manner that suggested effort rather than feeling. She touched her cheek, but no tear glistened there. Her glance flickered toward the table, the plates, the cups, not at the body. Mrs. Price and Mrs. Alderton were whispering rapidly, their earlier idle speculation having taken on a darker tone. The vicar's face was set, grave and taut, but his wife's was marked by guilt of a vague, irrational sort, as though she suspected her lemon tart had caused a scandal rather than a death. And near the edge of the lawn, a younger man, Mr. Noel Barton, whose family once owned the very cottage Mr. Graves now inhabited, stood with both arms folded, his jaw tight. Not shock, something closer to satisfaction, or at least resignation that a story long in motion had reached its expected ending. Miss Marple let her attention circle gently back to the plate, still sitting where Mr. Graves had eaten. The bite taken, the rest untouched. A faint scent still lingered, just a whisper under the sweetness of lemon. Bitter almonds. She let the thought settle with the weight of memory. Bitter almonds meant something unmistakable. A constable arrived from the nearby station, breathless and alarmed. He took statements, clumsy questions, and confused answers mingling together. In times of crisis, people rarely remembered things as they were, only how they wished to present themselves. Miss Marple said very little. She allowed herself to look mildly distressed, perhaps even a touch absent-minded, though her gaze traced everything. The slight scrape on Mr. Graves's teacup rim, the way Mrs. Hawthorne avoided looking closely at the dessert table, the single wasp circling the tart dish, curiously drawn to sugar and something else. As the constable finally instructed everyone to return home, assuring them the matter would be handled, Miss Marple rose with the same calm she had arrived with, though her thoughts were clear and sharp. "It is a terrible thing," Mrs. Chiverton whispered shakily to her, seeking comfort in the familiar gentleness. "A tragedy, to die so suddenly, without warning." Miss Marple gave a small, sympathetic nod. "Sudden deaths are seldom truly without warning," she said softly. "At least, not to those who know where to look." Mrs. Chiverton blinked, not understanding, but comforted all the same. Miss Marple walked home along the lane, her parasol tip tapping lightly on the path. The village appeared untouched by death. The hedgerows full of summer bloom, smoke rising from cottage chimneys, the distant sound of a milk cart rattling over cobbles. But to Miss Marple, the peaceful surface was always just that, a surface. And beneath it, something long buried had just stirred. She did not yet know who had killed Leonard Graves, but she knew why someone had wanted him dead. She had seen the pattern before, years ago, in another village, at another gathering, where charm and flattery had concealed. A very dangerous man, and Miss Marple understood. Something else, too, something essential. The murderer had not expected him to die so soon, which meant they would already be. Afraid and fear, Miss Marple knew, always loosened the tongue. The following morning dawned pale and still, the village unusually quiet, as if unwilling to speak of what had happened until absolutely necessary. Yet by breakfast, every kettle had boiled in every kitchen, and every curtain had twitched to observe who passed along the lanes. Word traveled in St. Mary Mead with the efficiency of a well-established postal route, and by 9 o'clock the whole parish knew that Mr. Leonard Graves had died at the tea, and that the circumstances were unsettling, a word which could suggest anything from mild impropriety to calculated murder. Miss Marple sat at her small round breakfast table, the lace cloth neatly arranged, and read the Morning Post with thoughtful slowness. A polite note from Mrs. Chiverton lay beside her teacup, full of apologies and distress, as though social embarrassment were the worst of tragedies. Miss Marple's gaze rested a moment on the signature before she folded the letter and placed it aside. A soft knock sounded at her door. It was timid, the knock of someone who did not wish to disturb, but very much wished to be let in. Miss Marple knew the pattern even before she crossed the sitting room. She opened the door to find Mrs. Price, looking distinctly agitated, her coat fastened improperly, and her hat slightly askew. May I come in just a moment, Miss Marple? It's all rather upsetting, you understand." "Of course," Miss Marple said gently, stepping aside. "Do sit down. I shall make you some tea." Mrs. Price accepted the offer with visible relief. Once settled in the cozy sitting room, she spoke very quickly, as though the words had been waiting just behind her lips since dawn. "You know, Miss Marple, some people are saying it was poison. I'm not saying so myself, mind you, but one hears things. And, well, Mr. Graves did take a slice of the lemon tart, a large slice." "Yes," Miss Marple said, pouring tea with steady hands. "I noticed." Mrs. Price leaned forward. "And there's something else. Something I didn't say to the constable yesterday, because, well, it didn't seem important at the time, and one doesn't want to cause trouble. But now, well, I think perhaps I ought to mention it." Miss Marple waited, giving no encouragement, yet offering no judgment. "You see, just before Mr. Graves took his slice of tart, Mrs. Hawthorne went to the table, only for a moment. She changed plates. I saw her. She placed one aside and took another. I thought at first she was simply choosing the prettier one. But now," Mrs. Price shuddered, "I can't help but think," Miss Marple's tone remained mild, "that she may have wished a particular plate to be taken by a particular person." Mrs. Price nodded, breathing a little too fast. "Exactly so. Exactly so. But I don't want to accuse anyone. Heaven forbid. I only thought you, well, you might know what to do." Miss Marple offered her a gentle, reassuring smile. "You have done the sensible thing, Mrs. Price. Quiet observation is often far more useful than bold declarations." The poor woman left shortly afterward, looking somewhat comforted simply by having shared the burden of knowing. Miss Marple stood a long moment at the window after she had gone, watching the slow sway of roses climbing her garden trellis. She had noted something in Mrs. Price's manner, not fear of the murderer, but fear of the truth, a subtle difference. She gave herself a few minutes to think, then fetched her hat and gloves. She did not go to Mrs. Hawthorne directly. That would have been too forward, too soon. Indeed, a criminal, if she was one, must never be prodded abruptly, for that only made them cautious and silent. Instead, she walked to the Barton cottage. The door was half open, as though someone expected company. Mr. Noel Barton stood in the doorway, sleeves rolled above his elbows, dust on his hands from tending to the neglected garden. He looked at Miss Marple with a mixture of reluctance and resignation. "I wondered if you'd come," he said quietly. "Then you must also know why," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but steady. He let out a slow breath. "Graves wasn't who he said he was. I knew it. Everyone knew it. Except Sylvia, perhaps. Or perhaps she knew," Miss Marple said gently, but hoped it did not matter. His jaw tightened. Well, it mattered to someone. Enough to kill him. Miss Marple looked past him, toward the small sitting room just visible inside, the room Mr. Graves had occupied these last weeks. On the writing desk, a locked leather case sat in plain view, not hidden, not proudly displayed, simply present, like a secret, waiting to be either discovered or stolen. Miss Marple met Noel Barton's gaze again. "Tell me," she said quietly, "what did Leonard Graves take from you?" Noel looked away, his voice low. "Not money, not property. My mother's peace." Miss Marple understood the meaning at once. The harm was not financial. It was personal, emotional, and emotional wounds, she knew better than anyone, were the most likely to lead to murder. But there was still something missing, something critical. Someone had wanted Graves alive long enough to benefit from him. Someone else had wanted him dead before he spoke. Two opposing intentions, two motives, two potential murderers. Miss Marple walked home slowly along the lane, thoughtful, calm, yet her mind entirely alert. The village looked the same as ever, but it no longer was. Not really. A quiet shift had taken place. The truth was no longer buried. It was moving, unfolding, revealing itself, one human weakness at a time. The next days passed with a quiet tension threaded through the village, the kind that settled beneath ordinary conversation and made every polite greeting just slightly too careful. The constable did his best to present an air of steady, procedural confidence, but no one truly believed the matter was as simple as a sudden attack of the heart. The doctor had sent word that there would be an inquest, and that alone was enough to ensure whispers would continue at every shop counter and garden gate. Miss Marple listened to the whispers, but only in passing. She knew that speculation rarely found the truth. It merely revealed the storyteller. What mattered was human nature, patterns of behavior, and the smallest details that slipped from people when they thought they were merely speaking about the weather. On the afternoon of the second day, Miss Marple took a gentle walk toward Mrs. Hawthorne's house. It was not a confrontation she sought, merely a conversation made to seem like a social call. Mrs. Hawthorne was in her sitting room arranging flowers, though her hands trembled enough to disturb the petals. "Oh, Miss Marple," she exclaimed, with a thin brightness in her voice that suggested she was exhausted from maintaining it. "How kind of you to call. I assume you've heard the dreadful business about the inquest." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "It is a sad necessity, I'm afraid." Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes flickered. "They simply must understand that he was not murdered. Leonard had a weak constitution. He often spoke of it." Miss Marple tilted her head with a small, sympathetic nod. "Oh, I had not heard him speak of it myself." "Well, he did," Mrs. Hawthorne insisted, too quickly. "To me, at least." In confidence. A silence followed, not long, but long enough for Mrs. Hawthorne to realize that she had offered a statement that could not be verified. Miss Marple looked at the flowers. White lilies, arranged carefully but without the usual delight. "You cared for him deeply, I think." Mrs. Hawthorne's breath caught. For a moment, something raw and real broke through the brittle composure. "I thought he cared for me," she said at last, her voice very small. "I thought perhaps, well, companionship at our age is not a small thing, Miss Marple. One wants someone to look toward, someone to think of." Miss Marple nodded gently. She did not judge longing. Of all the motives in the world, love was the most common and the most dangerous. "You see," Mrs. Hawthorne continued, her hands twisting together now, "people will say whatever they like. They always do. But Leonard was a good man, a kind man, a man of refinement." Miss Marple let her eyes rest briefly on a small object upon the mantelpiece, a silver photograph frame containing a picture. Not Mr. Graves, but a young man in a military uniform, smiling widely. Mrs. Hawthorne's late husband. A photograph she usually kept in her bedroom, now displayed in the sitting room. Miss Marple understood without needing to be told. Mrs. Hawthorne was not simply grieving a romance. She was grieving the betrayal of her own faith in her own judgment. "I do not doubt that you believed him to be so," Miss Marple said softly. "But belief and truth do not always coincide, I find." Mrs. Hawthorne pressed a handkerchief to her lips. There was no accusation in Miss Marple's tone, only the light suggestion that truth, when ready, would reveal itself. She did not ask about the tart, not yet. Miss Marple left quietly, and the soft click of the door closing behind her sounded like something final. As she walked back toward the village square, she noticed someone watching from across the lane, a young woman, slender, nervous, her hands buried in the pockets of her coat as though hiding something. Her name, Miss Marple recalled, was Alice Bartlett, a maid-of-all-work in several of the larger homes in the village, invisible in the way servants often were, and therefore always present in places others believed were private. Alice hesitated, then stepped forward. "Miss Marple, may I speak with you?" Miss Marple smiled, not with surprise, but with quiet invitation. "Of course, my dear. I believe you have something important to tell me." Alice's voice trembled, not with fear of Miss Marple, but of what speaking might mean. "It's about Mr. Graves," she whispered, "and what I saw him do, the night before he died." And just like that, the investigation shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the subtle inevitability of truth beginning to surface. Miss Marple listened with her full attention. Both suspects had been clear until now, but this was the first glimpse of motive that ran deeper than affection or resentment. Touched something older, something hidden, something worth killing for. Alice Bartlett's hands were clenched tightly inside her coat pockets, as though she feared they might betray her if given the freedom to move. Her eyes darted once to the street behind her, making sure no one else was near, before she leaned closer to Miss Marple. "I wasn't meaning to see anything," she began, her voice low but urgent. "I was only bringing back a book Mrs. Hawthorne had lent to Mrs. Price. It was late, gone 9 o'clock. and I thought no one would be about. But Mr. Graves? He was in Mrs. Hawthorne's garden, near the back window. Miss Marple gave a small nod to show she was listening, not pressing. He wasn't just out walking, Alice continued. He had a little case with him, and he was speaking to someone. Not Mrs. Hawthorne. She swallowed, her throat working. It was Mr. Barton. Miss Marple did not react outwardly. Her thoughts simply aligned themselves with this new thread. Alice's gaze flickered again. Fear, yes, but also the need to speak the truth, now that she had begun. They were arguing, she said, not loudly, but sharp. Mr. Barton said, "You've done enough harm. You won't get another penny out of anyone here." And Mr. Graves, he laughed. Her voice wavered. It wasn't a kind laugh, Miss Marple. It was like someone who knows he already has what he wants. Miss Marple's hands remained folded, her voice gentle. And what did Mr. Graves say in reply? Alice hesitated, then spoke the words as though they had stayed with her because she did not understand them and feared she now did. He said, "You've already paid once, and there are others who will pay again. People always pay when they have something to hide." A chill passed through the air, not of weather, but meaning, secrets, not one, several, and a man who made a profession of uncovering them, not for justice, but for profit. Miss Marple thanked her softly, with a kindness that steadied the young woman. Alice left quickly, relieved to have the weight no longer solely her own. Miss Marple stood for a moment beneath the low, flowering hedge, considering what she now knew. Mr. Leonard Graves had not simply arrived in St. Mary Mead to settle in comfort. He had arrived knowing exactly whom to approach and whom to threaten. She walked toward the high street, her steps unhurried, though her mind was swift and clear. She did not doubt Noel Barton had confronted Graves again at the tea, though quietly. A man wronged once might not strike in public, but he would watch carefully, ready to act if the threat should return. Yet Noel Barton had not shown fear when she spoke with him. Grief, yes, anger, certainly, but not fear of exposure. That distinction mattered. Mrs. Hawthorne, on the other hand, was trembling beneath every word she spoke. Yet her fear was not grief, nor guilt of poison. It was fear of humiliation, fear of being revealed as lonely, easily flattered, easily misled. The sort of fear a blackmailer could feed. Miss Marple thought then of the locked case in Graves's possession, still, resting on the writing desk in the Barton cottage, unclaimed. That was where the truth was waiting, not in statements, not in speculation, in writing. Letters, perhaps. Receipts, promises, old secrets renewed in ink. She knew exactly what must be done next, but it required delicacy and timing. The inquest was the following morning. The village would gather again, this time not in celebration, but in expectation, and expectation loosened tongues far more effectively than fear. Miss Marple went home to polish her silver tea tongs, not because they needed polishing, but because she always thought best when doing something small and orderly. She was certain of one thing now. The murderer had not acted to protect themselves. They had acted to protect someone else. And love, Miss Marple knew, could be far more fatal than hatred when placed in the wrong hands. The morning of the inquest arrived gray and close, as though the sky itself disapproved of what was to be examined. The village hall filled early. People who had barely exchanged greetings in years now sat elbow to elbow, whispering behind gloved hands. The vicar looked grave, the doctor tired, and the constable nervous enough that his notes shook faintly in his hands. Miss Marple sat quietly near the back, her presence gentle and unassuming. She watched, as she always did, the faces rather than the proceedings. Mrs. Hawthorne was there, dressed impeccably, though her veil did little to hide the strain around her eyes. Noel Barton sat in a modest, composed silence, his hands folded firmly in his lap. Alice Bartlett lingered near the door, uncertain whether her presence was welcome or necessary, her gaze flicking from person to person as if she were preparing to flee should the truth point her way. The coroner began, his tone respectful, methodical. Dr. Penworthy described the cause of death in technical terms: cardiac failure, consistent with poison. He hesitated only once when speaking the word cyanide. A murmur rippled through the room at the name. Bitter almonds, Miss Marple thought again, though she did not allow her expression to change. The constable made his report next, stumbling over details that mattered little and skating too lightly over those that mattered greatly. He seemed eager to settle the matter quickly, to restore the village's sense of normalcy. But the village had already changed. The air was different now, alert, heated beneath the quiet. "What you are suggesting," Mrs. Hawthorne suddenly said, standing without meaning to, her voice trembling, "is that someone here committed murder?" All eyes turned to her. She seemed startled by her own words, but unable to retreat. But who would do such a thing? Who here? Her gaze fell briefly on Noel Barton, and then snapped away again. Not accusation, fear of one. Miss Marple studied her closely. Noel Barton spoke then, unexpectedly. His voice was steady. Mr. Graves was blackmailing people in this village. A collective inhales moved through the hall. He had letters that could ruin reputations, perhaps even marriages. He made it clear he intended to use them. Silence followed. Not shocked silence, but the heavy, resigned kind that comes when something everyone privately feared has now been said aloud. Mrs. Hawthorne sat slowly, her hands shaking. Miss Marple watched her, and then Noel Barton. The coroner cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "These are serious claims, Mr. Barton. Do you have evidence?" Noel nodded once. "A locked case. In the cottage. It belongs to him?" He paused. "I have not opened it. I thought it should be done publicly. Properly." That last word mattered. It was the word of someone who wished truth, not concealment. The hall seemed to exhale, confusion and dread settling into the hush. Miss Marple rose then, not abruptly, not dramatically, simply enough that her presence became part of the room. "If I may," she said softly, her voice clear despite its gentleness. "Now that Mr. Barton has spoken of the case, I believe there is someone here who can tell us why Mr. Graves came to possess certain private letters at all." Her gaze rested, not on Noel, nor on Mrs. Hawthorne, but on Alice Bartlett. The girl startled, her face blanching, her fingers curling. I didn't mean to," she whispered. Miss Marple stepped closer, kind, steady. "You delivered his notes, did you not? Ron errands, not knowing at first what they were." Alice's breath broke on a confession. "He said they were business letters. I thought, well, he seemed so polite. But then, when Mrs. Hawthorne started crying one afternoon after I'd left one..." Mrs. Hawthorne made a small wounded sound, turning her face away. The room held itself still. Alice's voice dropped to a tremor. I tried to stop, but he saw me reading one of the envelopes. He said if I said anything, he'd tell people things about me. Things that aren't even true, Miss Marple. He made them sound true, just by saying them. Miss Marple nodded gently. This was what she had known must surface. Not scandals themselves, but the fear of them, and yet none of this named the murderer, only the motive. She looked slowly at Mrs. Hawthorne, then at Noel Barton. Both strong motives, both fear and love intertwined. But Noel Barton had confronted Graves openly, and Mrs. Hawthorne had switched the plates. Miss Marple saw the truth now, not as guesswork, but as pattern, behavior, and the quiet logic of the human heart. She did not reveal it yet. Not here, not with the village holding its breath in a single room. There remained one final step, one final test, a moment where guilt would reveal itself, not through logic, but reaction. Miss Marple lowered her gaze again, calm and patient. The truth was ready, but she would wait, because timing, as she always knew, was everything. When the inquest adjourned for the midday interval, the hall emptied in uneasy murmurs. People did not speak in full sentences, only fragments, glances, half-formed suspicions passing from one face to another. No one dared commit their thoughts to words. Not yet. Miss Marple, however, did not leave. She remained seated for a few minutes after the others departed, her gaze on the wooden floorboards, worn smooth by decades of village meetings, dances, and whispered confessions. Only when the room was nearly empty did she rise and walk slowly toward Noel Barton. He stood near the side wall, his arms folded, but not defensively, more like someone waiting for something he already knew was coming. "You showed admirable restraint," Miss Marple said quietly. His jaw shifted slightly. "I won't pretend I didn't want him gone, but wanting something and doing it are not the same." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "They very seldom are." She looked at him a moment longer, long enough to see the tired grief seated behind his calm. "You cared for your mother a great deal." He nodded, eyes lowering. She trusted him. He used her kindness against her. The money didn't matter. It was the humiliation, the shame she felt for believing him. She never recovered from it. Miss Marple laid a light hand on his sleeve, the gesture brief and sincere. "You have carried that alone, and you believed that if the truth of her suffering came out, the village would judge her." He didn't answer. "He didn't need to," Miss Marple continued gently, "but you did not poison him, because you wanted him to live long enough to return what he took." His silence confirmed more than words could. She left him then and stepped outside, into the chilled midday air. The clouds hung low. Promising rain, the constable approached, clearly eager to conclude matters simply. "If you ask me, Miss Marple, Barton's as close to a culprit as we're likely to find. Blackmail puts a man in a state. People do foolish things for family." Miss Marple smiled faintly, kindly, an expression often mistaken for agreement. "Oh, indeed," she said. "People do foolish things out of love. But poison, you see, requires forethought. A plan, a particular calmness of mind." The constable frowned. "You're saying Barton's too emotional?" "No," she replied softly. "I am saying he is not calm enough." She let the constable puzzle over that and walked on. She knew precisely where she needed to go. Mrs. Chiverton's house stood just beside the churchyard, roses climbing up its whitewashed front. Miss Marple knocked gently, and after a moment the vicar's wife opened the door, her face pale but composed. "Miss Marple, I expect you're here to ask about the tart." There it was. No hesitation, no surprise. Miss Marple stepped inside. The sitting room was immaculate, the tea service laid out as though expecting polite conversation. But Mrs. Chiverton sat down heavily, her hands twisting in her lap. "He was going to publish it," she whispered. "A letter. One I wrote years ago, before I married the vicar. It was foolish, just foolishness of youth. But if it became known, oh, Jane, the parish would never look at me the same. And my husband, He would suffer. Miss Marple listened, her eyes gentle. So he threatened you. Mrs. Chiverton nodded, tears forming now. He said I must persuade others to contribute, that I must help him. And I did try, Miss Marple. I tried to warn Sylvia, but she was already so taken with him. Her breath shuddered. And then, when he came to the parish tea, I saw him looking at me, the way he always did, when he was reminding me what he held over me, and something inside me just snapped. Miss Marple did not interrupt. The woman was not finished. I didn't mean to kill him, she whispered. I only wanted to make him ill, just enough to frighten him, to make him stop. But I misjudged the dose. He ate more than I expected, and then he fell. The words hung in the quiet room, fragile and final. Miss Marple spoke at last, her voice soft, almost sorrowful. The fear of disgrace can be a terrible thing, my dear. Many a tragedy has begun from that very place. Mrs. Chiverton covered her face with her hands. What will happen now? That, Miss Marple said gently, will depend on how you choose to speak when the inquest resumes. Outside, the first raindrops fell, light, steady, inevitable, just like truth. The rain had begun in earnest by the time Miss Marple and Mrs. Chiverton returned to the village hall. It softened the outlines of the cottages, muted the chatter of those gathering again, and lent everything the strange hush of events moving toward something that could no longer be avoided. Mrs. Chiverton walked slightly behind Miss Marple, her steps small and careful, as though each one required deliberation. No one would have thought her guilty of anything at all, only overwhelmed, pale, perhaps unwell. But Miss Marple knew the difference between fragility and remorse, and she could see that this woman had already accepted something within herself. The hall filled once more, damp coats steaming faintly in the close air. The coroner called the session back to order with a solemn tap of his gavel. Conversations fell away, eyes shifted, expectant, searching. The constable cleared his throat, prepared to resume with the straightforward, if misguided, theory he believed he now possessed. But Miss Marple rose. She did not raise her voice. She did not command the room. She merely stood, and the room stilled by instinct. There is something that must be understood before conclusions are reached, she said gently. Mr. Graves did not come to this village as a man seeking peace. He came as a collector of secrets. Every household here has its private sorrow or regret. Most are harmless things, the ordinary sorts of mistakes one might make while learning to live. Her eyes drifted with a kind softness over the assembled villagers, but Mr. Graves made a practice of finding these mistakes and turning them into chains. A murmur rose. Fear, shame, recognition, relief. Miss Marple raised a hand, just slightly, and the room fell quiet again. In such circumstances, several people might hate the man. Several might fear him. Several might wish him gone. But motive is not enough. One must also look for opportunity and, more importantly, character. Noel Barton watched her steadily. Alice Bartlett looked ready to bolt. Mrs. Hawthorne trembled. Miss Marple's gaze, when it settled at last, did not falter. Mrs. Chiverton did not wish to kill Mr. Graves. She wished to frighten him just enough to end his hold over her. But poison is a treacherous thing. It does not respond to intention, only measurement. A quiet, stunned intake of breath passed through the hall, like wind finding a crack under a door. The vicar's wife did not collapse. She did not cry out. She simply lowered her head, as if acknowledging a truth that had been waiting for its moment. The vicar rose beside her. his face white, not with outrage, but with a terrible sorrow. He took her hand, not to restrain but to steady. The room did not react with condemnation, only with the deep, uneasy understanding that the boundaries of sympathy and judgment are never as clean as one imagines. Mrs. Hawthorne let out a single sob, not of grief for Mr. Graves, but of recognition of how easily she might have been the one to act. Had she been braver or more desperate? Noel Barton closed his eyes briefly, a man relieved of a suspicion he had silently carried. Alice Bartlett exhaled, a trembling, exhausted release. The coroner spoke then, quietly. "Mrs. Chiverton, do you wish to say anything?" She nodded faintly. Her voice, when it came, was small and unadorned by excuses. "I was afraid," she said, "and fear makes small things feel enormous. I thought if I could just make him ill, he would go away. I did not understand the danger of what I held in my hand." The constable moved toward her, but gently, respectfully. The vicar remained at her side. Miss Marple watched, her face tender and sad. There would be no triumph here, no satisfaction in being right, only the quiet ache of a village, reminded of how human weakness can twist upon itself, unseen, until something breaks. When the hall finally emptied, Miss Marple stepped out into the rain, alone. The drops were cool on her face. The village felt softer now, fragile, as though it had been made new and was unsure how to proceed. She walked home slowly, her parasol angled but not opened. There were always tears beneath a murder, even when they were hidden. And Miss Marple, who knew so much of human nature, allowed herself a quiet sigh. People, she thought, were infinitely complicated and infinitely dear. The rain eased into a fine mist by late afternoon, leaving the hedges dripping and the cobblestones dark and slick. The village moved quietly now. Doors closed softly, voices kept low, as though everyone feared that even sound might disturb the fragile balance restored by truth. No one spoke openly of Mrs. Chiverton's arrest, but the knowledge traveled all the same, passed not by gossip now, but by gentle, uneasy acknowledgment. Miss Marple returned to her cottage and set water to boil, the simple, familiar act grounding her. Yet even as she moved about her small kitchen, placing the teapot on its tray and folding a linen napkin just so, her mind remained open and alert. There were still questions, small ones, but important. It was not distrust of the confession. Mrs. Chiverton had not lied, but Miss Marple knew that the nature of a tragedy is never fully captured in the moment of revelation. There were always ripples, consequences, quiet truths, unfinished threads. She had just settled into her chair when she heard a hesitant knock. It was softer this time, not fearful, but searching. Alice Bartlett stood on the step, her hair damp from the mist, her coat too thin for the weather. She looked tired, in a way that went beyond sleeplessness. "I didn't know where else to go," she said. Miss Marple welcomed her inside without question. The girl sat near the fire, rubbing her hands together for warmth. She stared at them for a moment before speaking, as though gathering courage from the visible world before confronting the invisible one. "Everyone will think that's all," Alice said quietly, "that it ends now." Miss Marple did not answer at once. She let the girl speak in her own time. Alice's voice trembled. But Mrs. Chiverton, she wasn't the only one he threatened. "And I don't think he planned to stop, Miss Marple. I think he meant to ruin more people. I think he planned to stay, to make a life here, feeding on everyone." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "I believed that was his intention." Alice looked up, startled that her darkest fear had already been understood. Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle. Mr. Graves was a man who understood precisely how to make people harm themselves, simply by offering them the chance to protect something they feared to lose. Such men seldom depart of their own choosing. Alice's eyes shone with something like grief, but deeper. "It's terrible," she whispered. "To be glad someone is gone." Miss Marple reached forward and took her hand, very lightly. "It is not terrible," she said. "It is human, and being human is rarely simple." For the first time since the tea, Alice's shoulders loosened. She breathed. They sat in quiet for a few moments, the fire crackling softly. Then Alice asked, not as a servant seeking instruction, but as a young woman asking something of someone she trusts, "Do you think Mrs. Hawthorne will be all right?" Miss Marple looked into the flames, the answer settling as gently as rain on roses. "She will suffer," she said, "but suffering can be endured if one does not face it alone. I believe the village will remember that she is not the only one who was deceived, and I suspect Mrs. Price will see to it that she is never without company for tea." Alice nodded. It was enough. She rose to leave, and at the door she hesitated again. "You knew from the beginning, didn't you? About the poison?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, the smallest, quietest curve of the lips. "One learns to notice things," she said, "especially when one has seen them before." Alice gave a slow, thoughtful nod and disappeared into the misted evening. Miss Marple closed the door softly and returned to her chair. The fire glowed warm, casting small gold flickers across the room. Yes, there was sadness here, but there was also restoration. The village would go on, lives would mend, though in new shapes. Grief would settle, as all things do, into memory. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Human nature, she thought, was endlessly fragile and endlessly strong. The next morning broke with weak sunlight, the kind that seemed uncertain whether it should warm or simply illuminate. A thin mist still lingered along the hedgerows, drifting pale across the village green. St. Mary Mead had the subdued air of a place that had witnessed something intimate and unsettling, and now waited to see what shape life would take next. Miss Marple rose early, as she always did, and laid out her breakfast tray with measured ease. She moved quietly, not from weariness but from reflection. She had seen many tragedies, many layers of human tenderness entangled with fear. This one, however, had left particularly delicate threads in its wake. Around 9:30, she put on her coat and stepped out into the crisp morning air. She was not headed anywhere in particular at first, only walking, which was her way of allowing the mind to settle into clarity. But she found herself, almost naturally, heading toward the churchyard. The vicar was already there, standing beside the lych gate, his hands clasped loosely before him. His face was drawn but calm, not the calm of peace, but the quiet composure of a man who has chosen his duties, even when they bring sorrow. He greeted her softly. "Miss Marple?" She returned the nod. "A difficult day for you, I expect." He exhaled slowly. "Yes, though I am more concerned for my wife than for myself. She has been resting." Miss Marple looked toward the vicarage windows, curtains drawn, though not entirely, a sign she was neither hiding nor wishing to be seen, but somewhere in between. "She will need time," Miss Marple said gently, "and kindness. Far more than judgment." The vicar's gaze lowered in gratitude. "The village will talk," he murmured. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but they will talk less in blame than in relief." They know, you see, that Mr. Graves did not come here to love anyone, and many of them have loved others unwisely themselves. The vicar closed his eyes, and his shoulders loosened just slightly, grief mixed with understanding. They walked slowly along the church path together. The air smelled faintly of damp stone and autumn leaves. After a moment, the vicar spoke again, very quietly. "There is one thing I don't understand. My wife. She is gentle, Miss Marple. She has always feared causing harm. How could she take such a step?" Miss Marple's voice was soft and carried no judgment. "Because fear is a curious thing. It does not only make us hide. Sometimes it makes us act, when the thing we fear threatens to unravel the very life we depend upon." She paused, allowing the words to settle. "Your wife thought she was protecting you, not herself." The vicar's breath caught, and in that moment, Miss Marple saw a truth far more important than guilt or innocence. He loved his wife, and that love would not collapse under this weight. It would bend and grieve, but endure. They parted quietly. Miss Marple continued through the churchyard gate and along the lane home, her steps unhurried. On the way, she passed Mrs. Hawthorne's garden. The widow was kneeling among the rose beds, her hat pulled low, trimming back the last of the summer blooms. She looked up when she heard footsteps, and though her eyes were red, her expression had steadied. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said softly. Miss Marple stopped beside the gate. "How do you fare today, Mrs. Hawthorne?" The widow breathed in, her hands resting on the garden shears. "I feel foolish," she said, "but not destroyed. I suppose that is something." "It is," Miss Marple agreed. "It is quite a lot." Mrs. Hawthorne looked back toward the house, then forward again. "I think perhaps I allowed myself to believe in something because I wanted to, not because it was real." Miss Marple smiled gently. "We are all capable of that. It is no crime to want companionship." "No," Mrs. Hawthorne said, "but one must be careful of the sort one accepts." There was a long, quiet moment, of shared understanding, of pain acknowledged but not allowed to linger. Miss Marple continued home, and when she reached her sitting room once more, she felt the faint shift that always told her a story had ended. Not abruptly, nor neatly, but completely. There would be days of recovery, of quiet recalibration in the village, of cups of tea shared between those who had once whispered now, offering comfort instead. Life would resume. And one afternoon, perhaps weeks from now, Miss Marple would sit in her garden, knitting in her lap, and hear faint laughter drifting over the hedges. Then she would know the balance had returned. St. Mary Mead had learned something again about the delicate nature of trust, fear, and the aching need to be seen kindly. And Miss Marple, who had no illusions about the world, felt a small, warm tenderness for it all. In the days that followed, the village arranged itself around its quiet grief with the instinctive gentleness of those who have known one another all their lives. Meals were left discreetly at the vicarage door. Letters of sympathy, written with careful, unassuming language, appeared in small stacks upon the hall table. No one spoke loudly in the grocer's shop. Voices softened, as though volume itself might bruise what remained fragile. Miss Marple noticed these things, but she did not intrude. She only watched as the village in its quiet way began to mend. One afternoon, only a few days after Mrs. Chiverton had been taken to await formal proceedings in London, Miss Marple took her gentle walk to the Barton cottage once more. There was still one piece of the matter she felt must be seen to. not for justice or punishment, but simply for closure. The locked leather case remained where it had always been, atop the small desk in the parlor. Noel Barton answered the door, and he seemed to have aged some years in the space of a week, not from guilt, but from the release of something long carried. "I wondered," he said, stepping aside to let her in, "if you would come." Miss Marple nodded lightly. These things have a way of asking to be settled. The room was still, filled with the soft scent of paper and old wood. Noel placed the case upon the table between them, its key now resting beside it, delivered by the constable earlier, once formal inquiries had ended. For a moment, the two simply regarded it. Noel unlocked it slowly. The catch clicked, the lid lifted. Inside lay letters, neatly bound stacks of them, names familiar to any who had lived here more than a season. There were some faded photographs, a few newspaper clippings, a lace ribbon, worn delicate with age. Nothing criminal in itself, only memories turned into leverage. Noel's jaw tightened, not with anger, but with sorrow. "He collected regrets," he murmured. Miss Marple touched the edge of one envelope, the handwriting unmistakably Mrs. Chiverton's, years younger, full of untested longing. "He collected loneliness," she corrected softly, "and loneliness is always the most profitable currency for those who know how to use it." Noel closed the case again, firmly but not violently. What should be done with it? Miss Marple did not hesitate. "It should be burned, Mr. Barton, quietly, without announcement, not as an act of vengeance, but of release." He nodded, and she knew he would do it, not for himself, but for everyone whose weakness had been placed in that box. She took her leave then. The mist had burned away, leaving the sky pale and high above the village rooftops. Children's voices could be heard somewhere in the distance, laughing in the last of the autumn light. As Miss Marple made her way back toward the lane, she saw Mrs. Alderton and Mrs. Price speaking near the gate of the green. Their tones were gentler now. They stopped when they saw her, offering polite greetings instead of conspiratorial whispers. A small, quiet shift. The village had learned something, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. That evening Miss Marple sat in her parlor with her knitting and listened to the clock tick softly against the hush of the house. The fire crackled, a sparrow fluttered briefly at the window. The world, as it always did, continued, and after a long moment of stillness, she smiled, not at triumph but at the simple, enduring truth she had always known. People, for all their secrets and frailties, were worth caring for. Every last one. As autumn deepened, St. Mary Mead regained its gentle rhythm. Leaves turned amber and gold along the hedgerows, and mist gathered in the early mornings. Life, as it always does, continued, though with a new, quiet humility settling over it. Mrs. Hawthorne began taking short walks each day, sometimes with Mrs. Price, who had shifted from gossip to a kind of protective companionship. Noel Barton was seen mending a fence beside his cottage, his movements steadier now that the long shadow of his mother's sorrow had lifted. Alice Bartlett found work in a nearby household with a kinder mistress, her shoulders no longer hunched with caution. In the vicarage, the curtains were opened again. Mrs. Chiverton would not return quickly, nor unchanged, but the vicar visited her regularly, and his letters spoke gently of patience and forgiveness. The village did not forget her, but they remembered her kindly. It was, Miss Marple thought, as she trimmed the last of the roses in her small garden, the best outcome that could have come from such pain. One crisp afternoon, she was visited by the constable, who removed his hat respectfully as she opened her door. Miss Marple, he began, shifting awkwardly. I suppose I should thank you. The whole village might have turned ugly if things had gone differently. Miss Marple offered a mild smile, inviting him to sit. People seldom turn ugly on their own, Constable. They turn frightened, and fear, when not understood, can become cruelty. All one must do is give fear its proper explanation, and it calms itself. He nodded slowly, though it was clear he understood only part of her meaning. After a bit of polite tea and conversation, he left, relieved, perhaps, that the story had ended without scandal consuming the village. Miss Marple returned to her chair by the parlor window, watching sparrows gather along the garden wall. The case had unfolded much like many she had known before, not born of wickedness so much as of longing for safety, affection, respectability, love, all very ordinary desires when held in balance, but when threatened, those same desires could turn sharp. That was the truth Miss Marple had always known. Murder does not spring from monstrous hearts, but from wounded ones. She set her knitting aside and folded her hands, letting the fire warm her fingers. She thought of Mrs. Chiverton, who had acted not from malice, but from the terrible fear that something cherished might be taken away. She thought of Mrs. Hawthorne, who had sought affection and found deception. She thought of Noel Barton, whose grief had shaped him, but had not hardened him. She thought of Alice Bartlett, who had finally been seen. In another life, in another village, the tragedy might have ended harsher. But here, where neighbors could not help but notice one another's sorrows, kindness had grown in the wake of truth. Outside, the church bell began to ring for evening service, soft, familiar, steady. Miss Marple rose. She took her coat from its peg, smoothing the sleeves with practiced hands. She stepped outside into the crisp air, the cottage door closing gently behind her. As she walked toward the church, past the green, past the rose gardens, past the cottage where the locked case had been burned to ash, she felt the quiet peace that comes after a storm. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but understanding. And that, Miss Marple knew, was the truest resolution any story could have.